Vlad the Impaler, a name that struck fear into the hearts of Eastern Europe in the 1400s. A name that echoed even to the courts of the Ottoman Empire. A name that today carries with it a sense of brutality and dread. How does a man build a reputation like that? A reputation forged in fear, shaped by violence, and remembered centuries later. Fear like that, dread of a single man, cannot just happen. It's created. It's cultivated. And in Vlad's case, it was weaponized. So it begs the question, weaponized to what end? Hello guys, and welcome back to another episode of The Civic Mandate. Sorry it's taken so long to get this episode out. We've had some issues with actually finishing the script, and as you'll see later in the episode, we do have a very special guest joining to talk about specifically the Orthodox faith and the history of Romania. Vlad the Impaler was the second son of Vlad Dracul. He was the king of Wallachia in the early 1400s. Vlad and his younger brother were both held as hostages by the Ottoman Empire in order to ensure the loyalty of their father. Later in Vlad's life, Vlad's father was killed by traitorous noblemen within Wallachia. This started a desire in Vlad's heart to avenge his father and kill these traitorous nobles. Throughout his life, Vlad worked with the Ottomans initially, and then with the Hungarians to attempt to retake the Wallachian throne, which eventually he did do. Vlad was a member of the Order of the Dragon, which was an order of nobility that was devoted to defending the cross and protecting Christian Europe from the Ottomans. In particular, any Muslim force attempting to usurp the West's authority in Europe. As would be seen throughout Vlad's life, his devotion to this order highlighted many of the actions he took in order to defend Wallachia, but also generally to defend Europe from the threat of Muslim invasions. Particularly the extent to which he was willing to go to accomplish this goal. Now, even though there was infighting initially with Vlad fighting to retake Wallachia, once he retook Wallachia, he did not continue to fight his fellow Christian nations around him, although that wouldn't mean he would never get into wars with them as a result of their backstabbing. But to highlight here his contention with the Ottomans. Now, this contention was not unfounded because both personally, his brother and him had both been abused by the Ottoman Sultan while they were held hostage in Gallipoli. But additionally, he also saw the threat to the sovereignty of Wallachia and the various other Christian kingdoms that the Ottomans posed. The Ottomans were an invading, marauding force intent on conquering Wallachia, Hungary, and all these other Christian kingdoms. We all remember Vlad for one reason, his habit of impaling. Why did he do this? Surely there was a reason. As someone who self-identified as a Christian man, surely he had a reason for what he was doing. Now, the first part of this is that the place he lived in is hard for us to really wrap our minds around. Wallachia, as it stood in the 1400s, was a land sandwiched between two major regional powers, both Hungary, the Kingdom of Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. These were both hungry for power within the region, and they were eager to expand into Wallachia. Wallachia's only threat was not simply the Ottomans, but also the various Christian nations who continued to fight against their own Christian brothers in another kingdom. Now, this is a trend we see in the West, that we can't seem to agree or come together on issues, or unite them until an issue gets so bad it requires that. Instead, we are perfectly content to continue to backstab and attack and take advantage of our fellow Christian nations. There was no safety for Wallachia, nowhere they could turn to, no one who would support them in their fight against the marauding Ottomans. Instead, when the Ottomans were fighting Wallachia, most other Christian nations invaded northern Wallachia and attempted to take land. That's not how we should be responding to our brothers being attacked. Additionally, we have to consider the time that he lived in, something that is perhaps harder to wrap our minds around, because we don't understand the medieval mind. Brutality in medieval warfare was quite common, especially in the area Vlad lived in. A lot of the warfare you see in the medieval age is simply intent on breaking the will of the people to fight. And that was the only way to win, especially if these Christian nations want to continue their Christian practice. They don't want their young boys to be pressed into the service of the Sultan. Muslims use these destructive fear tactics to fight their enemies and demoralize them. If the Christians didn't use these tactics back against them, they would never be able to fight to preserve their way of life. Instead, they would see their generations cut off. They would see their people have to go into hiding. They wouldn't have a sovereign nation anymore. Additionally, he had to deal with more threats from within Wallachia, including his own men attempting to betray him. He used fear to keep his men in line and continue fighting for him. His own men feared him. They respected him because what he was doing was he was keeping his land sovereign. But he also used fear tactics against his own men to keep them fighting for him. Regardless of the tactics he used, his people loved him since he did protect those who remained loyal to him. He had no patience for betrayal or traitorous people, but he did protect those who didn't betray him and remained loyal. Now, once he dealt with these internal affairs, he had to deal with his foreign enemies. His enemies who were constantly attempting to use subterfuge or treachery to kill or capture him. Specifically the Ottomans, but additionally the Hungarians. So he used the same strategy back at them. When he was giving tribute to the Ottomans, Vlad snuck his guard into Necropolis and launched a surprise attack which ended up capturing 2 high-ranking Muslim leaders, who he then impaled to send a message. Considering the situation he lived in, I would say that's a logical move to make. I can understand where he's coming from, requiring to use the tactics of his enemy. When Vlad did this and he impaled the 2 Muslim leaders from Necropolis, the Sultan declared a jihad and marched a 300,000 strong force into Wallachia in order to put an end to Vlad. This forced Vlad to turn to what would be considered shameful or dishonorable guerrilla warfare. Now, he didn't care. He was going to do whatever it took to defeat the enemy and keep his land safe. Now, this was rough for him because this is a 300,000 strong force, and according to the best estimates, his force couldn't have numbered more than 20,000. And his men were constantly deserting every time they saw the size of the enemy force. But Vlad continued fighting. And in the end, at least in this specific situation, it did end up working. Now, the sad thing about this is that he did appeal to his Christian brothers, the other nations surrounding him. Vlad was imprisoned by the Hungarian king. And then, of course, Pope Pius began an investigation, upon which the Hungarians began to spread blackmail propaganda against Vlad, which is unfortunate that we had to be fighting each other in this moment when we could have been uniting against the threat that existed against Wallachia. Vlad and his own brother even fought over the throne, which eventually resulted in Vlad being betrayed by his nobles and killed. Now, this was, of course, part of Vlad's 3rd and final reign over Wallachia. Now, when you have all these situations occurring, what is Vlad's response? Well, his response is to do what his enemies do: use fear as a wartime strategy. he had what was called a forest of the impaled, a forest of 20,000 impaled Turkish captives. Now, when the Ottoman Sultan arrived at the capital of Wallachia and saw the forest of the impaled, he turned tail and ran. He didn't want to stay around. His men were deserting him. If this is what our enemy can do, what will he do to us? And he won't give up. He'll defend his land to the last person. So Vlad's tactics worked. If he hadn't been betrayed by his nobles and by his fellow Christian nations around him, perhaps he could have forced the Ottomans out. But eventually the Ottomans installed a new, more favorable leader after Vlad was killed by his nobles. How tragic a story is Vlad's. He was stuck in a rough situation, a rough time, and a rough place. This is a pattern we're noticing as we're talking about these misrepresented figures. That each of these men were men of their times, men of their places, and men of their situations. They took action and did things that made sense to them at the time, and even some of their actions can make sense to us today, in our day and age. How many people will look back on the men of our time and say, oh, they were brutal. Oh, they shouldn't have used this rhetoric. But they will have never experienced our time, our place, our situation. They will not understand the many factors that fit into our decision making. So that's why I encourage you to think about Vlad's actions in a different light. Yes, they were brutal, but were they necessary? Perhaps they were. Now I want to introduce my good friend, Abraham. And if you didn't hear a name there, that's because I don't want to dox him. But he is a good Orthodox buddy of mine, and he is here to talk about the Orthodox faith, the Eastern Orthodox faith of Vlad the Impaler, and how that fits into our story about Vlad. Hope you enjoy his portion here, and thank you, Abe, for coming on and talking about this topic. All right, Abe, welcome to my show. I'm happy you could make it today, especially because this is not really a place of my expertise. We're going to be talking about the Orthodox faith, and you're my only friend who's Orthodox, so that's why I brought you on to talk about this. You're an Eastern Orthodox scholar, like you know everything about Eastern Orthodoxy, so that's why I'm mostly glad to have you on here.
Well, yeah, thank you for having me. You chose the best.
Of course. Well, particularly today, why I'm going to have you on to talk about Vlad is because Vlad's faith was very important to his story in general. Could you perhaps shed some light on that? How did Vlad's faith, his Eastern Orthodox faith, impact his life, his reign of terror in Wallachia, and generally just his character arc?
Well, by my understanding, again, I don't claim to be a scholar by any means, but by my understanding, in addition to the invading Turks' violence to his people, the people he ruled, they were also pressing a faith blasphemous and counter to his own. So his faith was very important there. Not only was he defending his homeland, but his faith and his people's way of life.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's certainly not an exaggeration to say that the Turks were there to eradicate the Christian faith. That was a driver for their invasion. How did Vlad view his defense of Wallachia? Was there a religious motivation to it?
Yes, he viewed it basically as a holy war, as a holy crusade. Very similar to how early crusaders viewed their exploits.
It could honestly be an extension of that too, if you really do think about it.
For sure. The modern world likes to look at the Crusades and just focus on the violence Crusaders committed, and in Vlad's case, his extreme violence, without looking at the bigger picture of Islamic conquest and the moral dilemma there of where the line is of self-defense and brutality.
Exactly. No, you're right. Especially considering before the Crusades, leading up to the Crusades, there were so many Muslim conquests, particularly against Christian Europe. And then even after the Crusades ended officially, there continued to be Muslim conquests, obviously culminating in the Battle of Vienna, when they were ultimately pushed back. So I could definitely see Vlad's fight against the Muslims as being a continuation of that holy war. But even today, in our modern age, it really, basically, if you talk to any secular person, they'll talk about how evil and vile Vlad was, because his religious place matters so much. What do modern Eastern Orthodox think about Vlad? Do they honor him? Do they disown him? How do they feel about him?
Well, it's a very, very complicated relationship we have with our good buddy Vlad, I don't know any Romanian Orthodox personally, but I've heard the Romanians really love him, and like some of them like icons of him and stuff, which I would say that's stepping across a line. But I definitely view him as almost an anti-hero, where he's not canonized as a saint. He's not a saint. I'm actually going to back up a little bit. I heard on a podcast from a famous Orthodox priest who has an online platform that key difference between Orthodoxy and Catholicism is in Orthodoxy, there's not really any such thing as holy war in the sense of like this whole Deus Vult, God wills it, like God wants me to go over there, like God told me to go over there and kill all these people. Like that's not as much of a thing. Now war is not forbidden. War is not considered evil. There are famous stories about elders sending their monks into battle to defend their homelands. But in Vlad's case, we view him as an extremist for sure because of his overkill and brutality.
And now that's not to say Vlad wasn't solidly an Eastern Orthodox, and we'll get into this a little bit later in this section. But while he was Eastern Orthodox, he did do a lot of donating to churches and monasteries, including one famous one, Snagoff, I believe. Yeah, so he was certainly very involved, at least in the local Eastern Orthodox community also. But like you said, never been canonized, which is the interesting thing. Something here for maybe my Catholic listeners. King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary basically imprisoned Vlad for 14 years or something crazy like that because, we can't stop fighting our Christian brothers for some reason. But imprisoned him, and part of his requirement to be released was Vlad's forced conversion to Roman Catholicism. I mean, this certainly does affect his sainthood status.
For sure.
What is maybe you don't know this, but what's the Orthodox teaching on forced conversions?
I don't know if anyone really knows what Vlad's personal convictions were at the time of his death, whether he was full-on Catholic or still at heart Orthodox. I don't think we'll ever know.
Perhaps this even has an application in our day and age now. And I am a Protestant, but and Abe's
no one's perfect.
No one's perfect. And Abe is a solid Orthodox Christian, but I genuinely think if you follow the Nicene Creed, we're brothers in Christ, and I think in the end we can have disagreements, we can have fights over issues of theology, but completely disowning, attacking, violently attacking, of course, but also using rhetoric to attack and not unite with those brothers, especially fighting the culture war and things like that, I think ends up just being very detrimental to our cause, and we end up accomplishing nothing. But yeah, well, thank you, Abe, for coming on to talk about Eastern Orthodoxy.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Is definitely, like I said, it's not a place where I have a lot of experience. So I wanted to bring someone on who knew the topic and would be able to talk with me about it.
Yeah, well, Hopefully I drove the point home.
Guys, if you want to see more of Abe, definitely make sure to tell me down in the comments so I can determine whether to fire him or hire him again for another episode. All right, thank you so much, Abe. I really appreciate that. Hope you guys enjoyed this episode. We would love it if you would subscribe, like this video, share it with your friends. It really does help us. I'm so sorry about the wait on this one. I was trying my hardest to get it out as fast as I could, but I'm working on mini projects which will be released to you very, very soon. I'm sure you've probably seen my teasers about them at least once or twice. With that said, have a great day, and God bless.